Mexican science fiction and Mexploitation films, contesting and negotiating identity beyond modernity.
La lucha libre en Denver, miércoles 12 de diciembre, el National Western Stadium Arena, La Parquita USA.
¡Lucharán a dos caídas de tres sin límite de tiempo!
There were two primary and inherently related projects designed to create a modern version of Mexico. One was the invention and establishment of a Eurocentric Mexican national identity, which came accompanied by the development of an industrial consumer economy. This pushed forward a culture of consumerism centered around imports found in department stores. With this also came the social result of the concept of la gente sente, or respectable, decent people, revamping the racist, Catholic-centered colonial ideals of Mexican identity into a cosmopolitan, class-based hierarchization. During the 1950s came another film genre wave to attempt to help redefine Mexican national identity. This was the genre of science fiction, which has been referred to as Mexploitation. The films were a phenomenon of consumerism, as they were for the most part really easy and quick to produce and made to appeal to the masses. In content, these films are a documentation of and response to the wave of technologies and the cult of science that came with the goals of modernity. Critics say that the modernity movement failed miserably due to the fact that it ignored and even denied Mexico's true history and cultural heritage. Yet, even if failed, it has had very concrete social, political, and cultural repercussions. The concept of nationality, as thought of before, was replaced by another kind of mentality, not devotedly colonial, yet still linked to very deep nationalistic ideas, indifferent to tradition, a coded indifference to our indigenous origins, and thus made unable to facilitate coherent visions of the national past and future. This enabled the subjugation to hierarchies and the logic of coloniality to continue. With modernity came an ahistorical nationalism, one which saw the past as obsolete liability and saw the future through the vague and idealized possibilities of modern progress. This ran parallel to the goals of the European Enlightenment, which once worked to push knowledge away from God and religion toward a more individualistic, supposedly science logic-based understanding of life. Well, modernity meant this to Mexico. It was a forced parallelism to Enlightenment, which meant a push toward technology and turning away from the past, seen as retrograde. As much as it was linked to religion, it was also linked to the history of colonialism and the genocide holocaust of indigenous peoples, as well as their continuous marginalization and imposed invisibility. Mexico was trying to steer away from colonialism's religious indoctrination, but remained centered in the goal religion helped fulfill: the indoctrination into the logic of coloniality now found embedded within the myth of modernity, its ideals and its goals. This plan was not created with the best interest of all citizens in mind. How could it, if Black and indigenous peoples were not even considered fully human? Much less were they experiencing the life of the so-called respectable and decent citizens. Modernity, consumerism, and the rise of technology supported a new kind of coloniality, one that brought about a cult of entertainment, media, and celebrities. This new religion came to replace the use of God as a tool for indoctrination. Now the control of the masses had become an endeavor of media and its diverse platforms, which had made it easier and faster to spread and propagate ideologies, ignore and thus make invisible colonial history, promote ignorance through hierarchical thought, and found Mexican identity itself on the revamped, perverse logic of coloniality, a perverse logic of modernity. We must not fall into believing there was a complete loss of power. The masses have not lost their power. It has been but tamed and smothered to an apparent silence. In Mexploitation films, we can see symbols, messages that see through the cracks of their binding. According to Doyle Green, in the 2005 book, Mexploitation Cinema, A Critical History of Mexican Vampire, Wrestler, Ape Man, and Similar Films from 1957 to 1977, the era of Mexploitation films is thought to be the darkest era of Mexican cinema, where there was supposedly no social vision. Films were perceived as unreflective of the problems and conditions of Mexican society. The government still controlled cinema. All movies had to pass censor boards. Final film product was decided by government officials, not producers, not directors. This created self-censorship for fear of the government. Because the government was paying for these films, they started to demand production and distribution quotas. Mexican cinema had to keep up to compete with Hollywood movies, so they increasingly relied on popular and predictable genre films to generate box office profits rather than to promote artistic, innovative, and social conscious cinema. With the rise of TV, cinema kept going down and led to to the development of what you can call B-movie film industry, cheap, shoddy, and superficial. But Mexploitation films were much more than that. They show a subversive complicity that can be deciphered from the apparent chaos and camp manifestations. Some of the elements of Mexploitation films include luchadores as the heroes, lucha libre cutscenes sprinkled here and there, limited budgets and quick production, surreal qualities due to the eclectic merging of apparently disparate film genres. They are only disparate when you think of these genres as unique wholes and everything else that is not strictly defined as invalid or outside of these norms. These Mexican films were introduced to the US by K. Gordon Murray during the 1960s. He made dubbed versions of the films in English, renaming the famous luchador libre El Santo, or the Saint, as Samson, a reference to the character of Samson in the Christian Bible. Mexploitation films are important cultural documents that address the conditions, contradictions, and visions of contemporary Mexican society, politics, and culture. They are unique counter-cinema that addresses key issues in Mexican society, the re-evaluating of Mexicanidad, the cultural conflicts between modernity and contradictions of hierarchized notions, and issues of gender politics. They show an emphasis on monsters and mad scientists, which depicted the disturbing nature of the conflicts between science, culture, and religion in a predominantly Catholic country undergoing a revamp with the imposed social change in the wake of industrialization and modernization. This is very similar to the approach of current HBO television series Lovecraft Country, which uses monsters as a way of depicting the horrors and uncanniness of the experience of being Black in a white supremacist society. We are aware these monsters are there, we can see them, but we question our mind. We double take, not only because we cannot comprehend exactly what they stand for or why they are there, but because we also do not want them to exist. There is less conflict involved when you close your eyes and think, I'm just imagining all this. You save yourself from having to confront the perpetrating factor and in turn be gaslighted by them and by society. The monster also creates a sense of estrangement, which beautifully shifts our perception into becoming more aware of that which lies beyond the effects and feelings that we can all agree are indisputably there, the otherwise invisible. In 1957, the seminal Mexploitation film was El Vampiro, produced by Abel Salazar. It became an instant success in Europe and Latin America. It was a major source of inspiration for the British Hammer Studios film Dracula, Horror of Dracula of 1958. This film was instrumental in launching the Hammer dynasty of horror films such as The Revenge of Frankenstein of 1958, The Mummy of 1959, and The Brides of Dracula of 1960. In the book chapter titled El Santo el Enmascarado de Plata found in Doyle Green's book, we read that lucha libre films were cheap copies of the Hollywood horror films. Yet, Abel Salazar's El Vampiro was released in 1957. It was not released in the US until K. Gordon Murray dubbed it into English 11 years later in 1968. Due to its old appearance, budget limitations, dubbed dialogue, and that it came out in late-night TV and drive-ins, it was dismissed by the United States Americans as a cheap Mexican knockoff of the Hammer Dracula film, even though it was the other way around. So, ultimately, if Hollywood horror films were inspired by Hammer films, and Hammer films were inspired by Mexican lucha libre sci-fi cinema, then Hollywood has been unknowingly following a line that was initiated in Mexico. Mexploitation films were the product of major studios and the combined efforts of respectable producers, directors, screenwriters, and actors in mainstream Mexican cinema. The most important development in Mexploitation was the incorporation of lucha libre into the horror genre. There was a television ban on lucha libre broadcasting by the Mexican government in the mid-1950s. Casting real-life luchadores allowed for extended wrestling matches to be included in the films, and in this way, they could go around the bans and the public could watch luchadores on television. El Santo was the most loved of all. In a silver mask, he was a Technico, a wrestler who bases his fighting on quality or technique, so one of the good guys. The Rudos, on the other hand, are those wrestlers who base their fighting on quantity or being hard and tough. They are the bad guys. In these films, we can see what appears to be absurd plot development in which the wrestlers would battle the bad guys in random public wrestling matches. The films were interrupted by gratuitous lucha libre matches tucked in at awkward moments. Mexploitation films are often called camp. Camp is that which is extreme and irresponsible. According to Susan Sontag, the fact that it is unintentional makes it more pleasurable. The only way something can be deemed camp is if it's considered as such by an outsider who thinks of themselves more refined and with superior cultural sensitivities. Jeffrey Scones introduced the term paracinema to describe such a cinema as an extremely elastic textual category which questions the mainstream and notions of quality and the hierarchical organization of high versus low art and culture. Scones defines camp as an aesthetic of ironic colonization and cohabitation, while paracinema is an aesthetic of vocal confrontation. After reviewing these labels, we can conclude that it is not that Mexican popular culture with its luchadores, sombreros, ranchero films, telenovelas, velvet paintings, colorful clothing, and Mexploitation is inherently kitsch or campy. Rather, these objects become kitsch or camp by virtue of having this status foisted upon them. Mexican culture is not kitsch, it's not lowbrow. It becomes kitsch in the eyes of the settler colonial logic of coloniality, when it is turned into a decontextualized souvenir, a Mexican curio in the universal archives of Eurocentric civilizations. The term Mexploitation is equally questionable. It comes from the label exploitation films. An exploitation film is any film which tries to succeed financially by exploiting a current trend, a niche genre, or a lurid subject matter. Subjects which these films exploit include, but are not limited to, sex, violence, and romance. We could argue that this is what all mainstream media and cinema has always done. Exploitation films are differentiated from other types of cinema primarily because they are generally low-quality B-movies. The term is supposed to differentiate exploitation films from art films, which are perceived as more serious for being independent films aimed at a special niche market rather than mass market audience. In other words, Mexploitation films are not for la gente sente. Mexploitation films are a cinematic cultural takeover by the presumed desires of la gente que no, or those who were not considered respectable for the most part, the indigenous and black and the poor, during a time when capitalistic ends became more important due to classist trends. So-called Mexploitation science fiction films can also be very serious, and they attract mass critical attention and cult followings. They present information in between the lines, not quite Hollywood, not quite art, yet some of these films such as Night of the Living Dead from 1968 and the Luchadores films set trends and become historically important as they document the process of the invention and reinvention of culture, in the case of Lucha Libre, of Mexicanidad. We may observe Mexicanidad from a mass level interestingly through the conceptualization of an archetype or individual expression that represents the masses, el Santo.
El actual campeón, el Santo.
El Santo el enmascarado de plata, the saint masked in silver, is to Mexican science fiction as Pedro Infante was to el cine de oro, to Golden Age cinema. El Santo spent most of his public life openly searching for his identity. He was born in Tulancingo, Hidalgo in 1917, and he first began his career as a luchador libre at the age of 17 in 1934. He was first known as Hombre Rojo, Red Man. Then he went through several other names, such as Enmascarado, Masked One, Murciélago, Segundo, Bat, the Second, and Demonio Negro, Black Demon, before becoming El Santo. His identity was ever-changing before the public's eye, displaying a personal try-and-fail process that allows us to see what did and did not appeal to the masses. Santo, the saintly name, and the silver mask stuck and launched him into massive popularity. Lucha Libre is a fight between wrestlers who are rudos versus those who are técnicos. El Santo began his career as a rudo, one of the bad guys. In the 2008 book, The World of Lucha Libre, Secrets, Revelations, and Mexican National Identity by Heather Levi, the Technico is said to be characterized by his grace. Just like a matador needs to moverse bonito, move nicely, the Technico needs to have good knowledge of acrobats since he spends a longer amount of time on the ropes or up in the air than the rudos. The Technicos need to enter the ring by doing a backflip or a front flip, jumping over the ropes. They never get tangled in between the ropes, nor do they go under them. On the other side, the rudo's weight is cemented in the ring and makes more use of hard brute force. The rudo hits, raises, and lets go of their opponent. In the words of a luchadora who was a ruda named La Briosa, found in Cristina Pacheco's 1990 book Los Dueños de la Noche, The Owners of the Night, el técnico entrena más, pasa más tiempo en el gimnasio. Los rudos son más libres, nos dejamos llevar por el temperamento. The técnico trains more. They go to the gym. Rudos are more free. We let ourselves be driven by our temper. Between them stands an abyss, which separates brutality from skill. This is obviously related to identity and the supposed ideals of fixity. For Latin Americans and their descendants, identity is like lucha libre, a sport of melodrama. The técnico is a defender of a social and moral order. Professional wrestling is a sport in the mode of melodrama. The term has since come to refer to performance genres that present a polarized worldview in which moral struggle is made visible, announcing itself as an indisputable force through an externalization of internal emotions. It is just like luchador rudo Apolo Dantes puts it, es la vida misma, los policías y los ladrones. Es la relación que tenemos en todo. Es cuando ves que el malo le pega al bueno en la película y te enojas y quieres que el bueno se defienda. Es una forma que siempre ha existido y es es muy común en Mexico. It is life itself, the cops and the bad guys. It's the relationship we have with everything. It's when you see the bad guy hit the good guy in a movie and you get mad and you want the good guy to defend himself. It's a form that has always existed and it is very common in Mexico. According to Levi, lucha libre's tradition of mass performances can be traced to indigenous Mexico and the Americas falling into two categories of performance, satirical and parodic genres or roles. For example, there are variations on the role of sacred clown reported in indigenous communities from Chiapas to Sonora. These include the Yaqui Pascola, who dance at saints' festivals, the Mayo Paricero, who crucify Christ in the Passion Play, and the Cojetic in Chiapas, who appear during the festival of Carnival to parody town officials. The role of sacred clown is generally interpreted as an inversion ritual, in which the clowns deliberately violate community and natural norms in order to make them explicit or as a way to criticize the powerful without risking retaliation. In the case of lucha libre, these sacred clowns are the prototype ancestors of rudos, who incarnate and play the role of the enemies of the community. This is one more of the infinite qualities of the border logic that Mignolo says is needed to counteract the logic of coloniality. Life in the once colonized regions of the Americas, with its covert and ambiguous battle between coloniality and border thinking, is overtly represented in the wrestling ring. A great visible and lucid combat takes place. This violent struggle is the basis for the border fronteriza identity that exists across the Americas, beyond the territories where we can see a physical border. In lucha libre, we see the dance of the external and internal struggle. We see ourselves in the Technico, but also in the rudo. According to Gloria Anzaldua's chapter, La Conciencia de la Mestiza Toward a New Consciousness, found in her 1987 book Borderlands La Frontera, a counterstance locks one into a duel of oppressor and oppressed, locked in mortal combat. Both are reduced to a common denominator of violence. In lucha libre, we see the performance of this daily and generational struggle simultaneously occurring both outside and inside ourselves, both literally and metaphorically, as our bodies, minds, and spirits experience the moment silently within, in private, individually, while simultaneously sharing an almost telepathic interconnectedness with those survivors and descendants of luchadores, fighters of the eternal violent struggle. In the arena, as spectator and participant, we become hyper-aware of the deep connection shared by the anonymous roaring masses who deeply and sometimes only unconsciously understand that we are performing the complex experience of being forced to wear multiple masks, be it as liberators, as oppressors, and sometimes even both. The counterstance refutes the dominant culture's views and beliefs in a binary reality, and for this it is proudly defiant. All combats are the same eternal combat, the one between cops and criminals, between the one that functions within society and the one who does not, between the one that belongs and the one who never will, because this is an incarnation of the combat between border thinking and the logic of coloniality. In Anzaldúa, this constant combat provokes an evolution and turns those who survive it into a type of powerful hybrid. At some point, we have to leave the opposite bank, somehow healed, so we are in both shores at once, and at once see through serpent and eagle eyes. Our identity is always a mask, but in the case of the border identity, this mask is liquid and ever-changing. And just like El Santo, we may fixate on one identity once we see it gives us the results we seek. The border consciousness allows for us to see beyond the mask, to see it as what it is, not take it so seriously. Thus, we do not only use masks to hide ourselves, but also as trophies that showcase openly and proudly our resistance and bravery. The mask is not simply an extension of the self, but an emblem of our contested existence and consequent survival. And as good luchadores, we reject assimilation and keep up a constant battle to protect our right to the identity multiplicities that we have earned through generations of struggle. We reject perpetual assimilation and keep up a constant battle to protect our right to the identity multiplicities we have earned through generations of struggle. Octavio Paz wrote in his book Laberinto de la Soledad in 1950, toda la historia de México, desde la conquista hasta la revolución, puede verse como una búsqueda de nosotros mismos, deformados o enmascarados por instituciones extrañas y de una forma que nos exprese. Mexico's entire history, from the conquest to the revolution, can be seen as a search for ourselves, deformed or masked by strange institutions, and in a form that expresses us. To Paz, the Mexican, no matter where they are from or what they do in life, is a person that closes off to protect themselves. Their face is a mask, and so is their smile. The mask now as an emblem of struggle for the right to a multiple identity, and cultural production that seeps through Mexploitation films are the product of dialogues among diverse cultural expressions that in themselves may also be confronting clashing mixtures. These cultural expressions include, but are not limited to, the popular Mexican archetype of the paisa, the chicana, the indigenous, the Afro, the Euro, and the Asian. Add to the mix the complex border experience, plus the effects of globalization resulting from the coloniality of power upheld by the logic of coloniality. The mask has a specific function of myth. Paz writes, "Por obra del mito y de la fiesta, secular o religiosa, el hombre rompe su soledad y vuelve a ser uno con la creación. Y así, el mito, disfrazado, oculto, escondido, reaparece en casi todos los actos de nuestra vida e interviene decisivamente en nuestra historia. Nos abre las puertas de la comunión." By work of myth and fiesta, secular or religious, man breaks his solitude and once again becomes one with creation. In this way, the myth, disguised, occult, hidden, reappears in almost all acts that make up our lives and decisively intervenes in our history. It opens up the doors for communion. The centralized version of Mexican identity, the one that sees fronterizos as not as Mexican as them, is also an invention of Mexicanidad, a hierarchization of the center versus the peripheral, or what people in Mexico City like to call the rest of Mexico, provincial. The centralized version of Mexican identity is just another mask, yet the border expression incorporates key elements that distinguish it above question. It is hyper-conscious of the nature of identity as mask, and never in communion with itself. It also does not live in communion with others around it. Its struggle is constant, and it is all parts of its life experience. We are used to it. The luchador libre encompasses the consciousness that sees through the hypermyth that leads in its antithesis, for it is not simply wearing an elaborate and unique mask, but he is performing the mask itself, the action from which we derive our power. And just as the luchador libre, we perform through masks with subversive complicity to escape the dominant forms dictated by clear demarcations and borders. The luchador is able to use its agile acrobatic skills to cause estrangement and highlight the fact that we are deriving meaning from much which has been imposed and superimposed, and that any understanding of Mexican identity is a product of a performance that is not fixed and has something very valuable to contribute, as it constantly changes with the times, as it continues to resist, as well as cooperate in order to maintain the fight.